All right. It's all yours, Alexei. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, hi everyone. So yeah, I was asked if I would like to give a presentation related to reference standards for AI performance evaluation studies, especially in the regulatory context. And yeah, that's what I'm here to do today. First, a standard disclaimer that the mention of commercial products, their sources, or their use in connection with material reported herein is not to be construed as either an actual implied endorsement of such products by the Department of Health and Human Services, of which FDA is a part. Brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. First, I'll tell you about where I work at the FDA. Then we'll discuss briefly some background on what are AI-enabled medical devices for FDA purposes and what are some of the regulatory basics. And then the bulk of the presentation obviously will be about reference standards. Yeah, so I work in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH, where we have about 1,900 employees processing about 22,000 pre-market submissions per year. Within the Office of Science and Engineering Labs in CDRH, about 183 employees consult on about 2,500 of those pre-market submissions, and these are the submissions where expert input is needed from researchers working in the relevant research area. Yeah, so here's a cartoon of a happy OSL employee who is wearing two hats, a regulator and researcher hat. Yeah, within the division, within the office, I'm in the division of imaging diagnostics and software reliability, where we have 41 federal employees and also some interns, fellows, students, and we process about 800 pre-market regulatory consults per year where expert input is needed, and a large fraction of those is related to AI and mostly medical imaging AI or machine learning type devices. And of course, we also do research. These are the main research areas pursued in our division. So that is for artificial intelligence and machine learning, medical extended reality, digital pathology, as well as medical imaging and diagnostics. And clearly there are intersections between these four areas. The topic of today's presentation actually is one such intersection area. Okay, so now let's briefly talk about machine learning enabled medical devices. So first of all, what is a medical device? And for regulatory purposes, basically, one maybe can say anything medical that's not a drug or a biologic product that is a medical device. And this also includes software, which also includes AI or machine learning enabled software, such as visualized by this image right here, where it marks certain parts of the medical image. Okay, so then since I really focus a lot on medical imaging in this presentation, I want to briefly tell you about the use cases of AI in medical imaging. So I've drawn here a medical imaging chain, like a modern medical imaging chain, so to speak. It starts with image acquisition, where you can have different modalities like CT, MRI, ultrasound, whatever, that yields some raw data. The raw data may need to be pre-processed to go through reconstruction algorithms or other kind of processing algorithms such as denoising. Then this yields a patient image for interpretation by a clinician, and this yields something like a report in the end. And in fact, nowadays AI is used at every step of this process. And I put a few examples on this slide. The one on the left, that's an image, then AI-guided ultrasound image acquisition device, which basically tell you how to position the probe on the patient. Then this one is, I believe, a deep learning-based algorithm to increase signal-to-noise ratio and resolution of an MR image. This one is a computer-aided triage system that notifies specialists of suspicion of stroke based on head CT images, so those patients can be processed sooner since it's time sensitive. And this image, I believe, is a computer-aided diagnosis system for breast cancer. Yeah, and then the final step on the cartoon is the report. And of course, you can also use AI to process the report using natural language processing techniques. Yeah, so we see just like medical devices are very diverse, AI-based medical devices, in particular medical imaging, are also very diverse and many possibilities. So, well, how they are regulated? Basically, the FDA and other regulatory bodies employ a risk-based classification paradigm where medical devices are classified and regulated according to their degree of risk to the public, which is informed by both the technology and the intended use of the device. So it ranges from the lower risk devices, such as which are the class 1 devices, such as the sterile glove, and up to higher risk devices, which are in the class 3 category, such as this coronary stent shown on this slide. The AI-enabled medical devices mostly, to the most part, fall somewhere in the middle on the spectrum, which is in class 2. And I believe the majority fall in the 510K pathway, regulatory pathway. So this means that a company will have to demonstrate that their device is substantially equivalent to a already legally marketed other device, which is called a predicate device in the regulatory terminology. And then, of course, within the 510K pathway, different types of devices will be handled differently. There are a lot of classifications for different types of devices with different requirements. Here I show you a few options for radiological categorizations that apply to AI-based devices. So we have computer-aided detection devices, or CAD-E, abbreviated CAD-E. This is, for example, software that directs a clinician's attention to an area or region on a medical image. We have, sorry, I just lost my screen. If we have computer-aided diagnosis devices, abbreviated CAD-X, these are devices that aid in the classification of lesions suspicious of cancer or other diagnostic tasks. You can also combine the two categories. Then you get CAD-E/X. So this is combined. It detects as well as diagnoses a disease. You have computer-aided triage and notification systems that would notify a specialist of time-sensitive patient conditions, or maybe reorder the patient queue to be more efficient. There are radiological acquisition, optimization guidance devices, and automated radiological image processing software. So these are just some of the possibilities there so far. So then let's move on to the main topic. That's reference standards. So what it is, what are the issues, and what are some of the open questions. First, I want to talk about the term ground truth. So in machine learning, that's a term that's used quite often, especially when we talk about supervised machine learning. However, the problem with this term is that it involves the word truth, and truth carries some sense of absoluteness. So then this absoluteness may not always be given in a given application. So for example, if you have a very simple task such as this cat versus dog AI, then probably you can talk of truth here, because a human annotator can go through all the photographs that show either a dog or a cat and can label them as is it a dog or is it a cat, and probably they'll be 100% accurate in annotating those images. But then once you move on to slightly more challenging problems like ImageNet classification, the famous ImageNet, then you already start getting some issues. For example, here I show 3 random images with label monitor from the ImageNet validation set. And you see it's already not very clear why this should be, for example, labeled monitor, because it also shows in the middle image a person or child. So why it's not labeled person? In the right image, it also shows a couch that's as big as the screen and so on, but it's labeled monitor. So it's already not 100% clear here that the label really describes the true state of the image. And then once you move to medical applications, it becomes, of course, even more challenging. An example I show in the image here is the process of annotating a whole slide image of a prostate biopsy with its Gleason score. And basically, if you wanted to be really accurate here, with the annotation, you would almost have to annotate every cell, which is totally infeasible for human annotators to do for every image. So clearly, if you have two different people, two different experts annotating the same image, there will still be variability between how they draw the outlines and how exactly they assign the labels. Yeah, so we see that truth carries a sense of absoluteness and an objective standard of truth with negligible error, and variability rarely exists for real-world tasks, especially in medicine. So and that's why we have terminology such as reference standard or reference truth, because it falls short of providing the absoluteness implied by truth, but is still used as the labels for machine learning training or testing. We can also look into literature for a more formal definition. So this is language from the well-known START 2015 guidelines. So this defines clinical reference standard as the best available method for establishing the presence or absence of the target condition. And they also define the term gold standard, which would be an error-free reference standard. One thing to note here is that this definition specifically is written for diagnostic accuracy studies of essentially a binary classifier between a condition present versus condition absent output. And if you have other tasks, such as a detection task or segmentation task or other tasks, you may need other types of reference standards, such as bounding boxes or segmentation contours and so on. Yeah, so the point I'm trying to make is that the reference standard needs to be task-based. So it has to reflect the clinical tasks that the algorithm is intended for. While this presentation is focused on performance evaluation, especially in the regulatory context, I also briefly want to mention that for training data, one can be generally a little bit more flexible with the reference standard considerations, because even a poor reference standard may still provide a usable training signal. However, I just want to caution that one still has to be careful even in training data, because a biased reference standard may lead to a biased algorithm. Or if you have different types of reference standards for different subgroups of your population, you'll have different algorithm performance potentially for different subgroups. So one has to be careful of those issues even on the training data. Yeah. However, for testing or performance evaluation of medical AI systems, a good task-specific reference standard is really crucial, as we'll discuss on the following slides. Yeah, so I've been mentioning performance evaluation on every slide so far, but I have not told you what it is. So I just want to kind of briefly say what I'm talking about, so we're on the same page. So here's the basic option: is we have some test data and we can collect a reference standard on it. And then we take an AI algorithm that's already been trained and it's, so to say, frozen. So that's a production software. We apply it to the test data as well. And then we can compare the output of the AI to the reference standard in a pre-specified statistical analysis. And we get a performance measure back, which we call the standalone performance of that algorithm. Another common option is if we have an AI system that's intended to be an aid to a human or a clinician. So then we really want to evaluate the human AI team rather than the standalone AI, right? So that corresponds to this kind of graph in its simplest form, where I added two bubbles in the middle here. One is where we have clinicians looking at the data without the aid by the AI, and another bubble is where we have multiple clinicians who look at the data with the AI aid tool, and then we compare these two study arms against the reference standard and against each other in a pre-specified statistical analysis. And maybe we get some kind of performance results like this ROC curves. Maybe the red one is for clinicians who use AI, and the blue one is for clinicians who didn't use AI. And then you see, oh, well, the ones who used AI did actually do better in this case. Okay, so first issue I want to raise again is that the reference standard needs to reflect the clinical task. I think I already said that, but here I give some examples from literature. First one, it's a well-known paper from Science where essentially they look at a commercial machine learning algorithm that is intended to flag patients with complex health needs to receive additional care. However, during training and testing of that system, they assume that health costs is a good approximation to health needs, and that resulted in substantial bias against Black patients in that case. So that is not a good reference standard to take health costs as a proxy for health needs. Another example, there are multiple papers about also commercially available AI systems for automatic prediction of sepsis. So these are intended as early warning systems for sepsis for hospitalized patients. And there have been papers that have found that performance they observe in the real world is far worse than that reported in prior studies. And then they looked at the reason why that happens. And a lot of it is tied to how the event of sepsis is defined, how a true positive finding of sepsis is defined in those prior studies. And a lot of times it was not defined in a way that's clinically relevant. So how do we know what is a clinically relevant reference standard? In the regulatory context, we basically mostly have to look, first we have to look at the intended use or the indications for use of a device. So what is that? The intended use is the general purpose of the device or its function. So that's how it is defined. And this includes the indications for use, which describes the disease or condition the device will diagnose, treat, prevent, cure, or mitigate, including description of the patient population for which the device is intended. It can also include the description of the user population if the device is meant to be an aid to a clinical user. And it should also include other information. So we then are able to answer the question of how the device will fit into clinical workflow. And then we will hopefully be able to tell what is a clinically relevant reference standard for that device evaluation. Okay, next topic I want to talk about is the granularity of a reference standard. I kind of collected a few options here on this diagram, and I believe this is probably mostly applicable to medical imaging. And I try to order this starting from the lower granularity reference standards to the higher granularity ones. So here we start with patient level or image level. The labels such as a categorical class label as malignant versus benign. It can also be continuous or multi-class label. Then we can have region-based image annotations such as localization markings or bounding boxes, such as those that show that are used for cancer detection tasks. Or we can have pixel or voxel level annotations such as segmentation contours for applications where it's important to identify a boundary of a region correctly. So while for training, you probably are very happy if you have a more granular reference standard because that just carries more information. For testing, we always want the reference standard that's clinically relevant for the specific task at hand. So once we know the granularity of the reference standard we want, there are also many options how it can be collected or acquired. Again, I list a few options here. This is by far not the complete list, but these are just those that came to mind. And maybe it's also more related to medical imaging than other domains. So you may have an interpretation by a single physician. You can have an interpretation by a domain expert who can be a generalist or a specialist, such as a subspecialty radiologist. You may have an interpretation by multiple experts, such as a panel of radiologists, or maybe a panel of experts from different disciplines, including interpretation of different modalities that is then combined to get a single reference standard. You may have a follow-up for the patient after a pre-specified time period, maybe a 1-year follow-up or something like that. You may have a biopsy result, an autopsy, or patient survival, also other options. So on this slide, basically, I tried to order them very roughly from something that feels like it's more subjective to something that's more objective reference standard. And of course, the more subjective the reference standard is, the more potential there is for issues. And a few such issues I discuss here. So first of all, if your reference standard is very subjective, then there's a potential for bias against certain subgroups. An example reported in the literature is if you would use pain ratings given by medical professionals as a reference standard for a machine learning system, that would not be good, because it has been shown that medical professionals tend to view pain complaints by female or Black patients as exaggerating when compared to pain complaints by male or white patients. More generally, we can use the term measurement bias, I believe, which a way to define this is that it's a variance in the reference standard that does not fully represent the true variance in the attribute of interest. So an example of this would be if you look at systematic differences between subjective readings by radiologists who may come from different types of clinical establishments or with different levels of experience. Or maybe another example would be if you take clinical specialists who look at images of the skin, and you take one from an Asian country, another one maybe from a European country, and even if both of them have a lot of experience, they've seen widely different distribution of skin tones and skin disease in their practice, and so it may happen that there will be systematic differences how they evaluate the same skin image. Yeah, so then going back to this diagram, you can actually put another scale next to it. And again, this is very rough, but approximately I try to order them going from those reference standards with the highest variability to those with the lowest variability. So this is my variability scale. And then I thought I'll also put a third scale next to it. And that is a scale of convenience or availability, because obviously some of these more objective reference standards, they are not readily available for a lot of patients. Like you cannot collect a biopsy from healthy patients, so you cannot just wait for patient survival outcome for everybody in most cases. Yeah, and again, the higher the variability is of a reference standard, the more potential there will be for certain issues. However, because there's availability involved here, sometimes you may not be able to acquire the most objective reference standards, and sometimes the one with variability is the best you can do. So let's discuss some of the associated issues. The first one, let's call it imperfect reference standard. So that's basically describes the variability in the reference standard. It's a reference standard procedure that's imprecise, such as an image interpretation by one clinician per image, when the reference standard is in a domain that is known for high reader variability. And so on the other hand, if you want to use the reference standard with low variability, it may not be available for every patient, as I discussed before. And that leads us to the issue of verification bias. So that is a bias in performance evaluation when the performance is based only on the subset of subjects verified for present absence of the condition with the reference standard, the method of choice. Or it also may be a situation where different reference standard methods are used for different patient subgroups. So an example would be when a radiology AI system, aid system is tested on biopsy-proven cases only, even though later on in the clinic it's intended to be used for both biopsy-proven and non-biopsy-proven cases. So verification bias, that's actually also related to missingness of a reference standard. And another type of bias related to missingness is discrepant resolution or analysis. That's something that I keep coming across in performance evaluation studies for AI systems, and it's real hard to deal with. So what this is when somebody wants to acquire the reference standard only on cases where the readings of two modalities are different. So for example, if we are comparing an AI system against a human clinical expert, and we are collecting the reference standard only on cases where the human and the AI disagree. So we don't even collect the reference standard on cases where they both say positive or both say negative. And obviously this is if you have data like this, you can no longer measure absolute performance metrics such as sensitivity or specificity because you don't have the reference standard for most cases in the study population or study sample. However, maybe it's possible to still do a statistical test or measure for the difference in performance between two study arms for certain performance metrics. Yeah, but this is an area with a lot of open questions, I would say. Another area with a lot of open questions is when we have an indeterminate category as either the type of algorithm output or a type of reference standard category. And that also happens sometimes where maybe clinical guidelines even have requirements that in certain cases an indeterminate category has to be assigned to a patient, or an algorithm developer may want the algorithm to say, I don't know, so say indeterminate, rather than always say a specific classification class. And here, of course, it's then, if you have that category, it's very unclear how to use a traditional metrics such as sensitivity and specificity, how that would be incorporated in that calculation. So what ends up happening, especially in medical imaging, in a lot of cases, is that one uses a reference standard that's a panel of experts. So you have multiple expert truthers that annotate the data, and then in some way you combine the interpretations into a single reference standard. And there's quite a lot of literature about this approach, where people looked at whether this is appropriate or not. And I just list a few papers here. I don't want to go through all of them in interest of time, but I kind of liberally put some smiling or frowning faces next to them, because some of them say that's a not good thing to do. You don't get a good reference standard that way. Others say that's a good and robust reference standard, yet others say this is not a really good reference standard, but it's the best option we have. So there's still potentially issues even in that common approach. Here I list some papers to address the variability of subjectivity, in particular in those type of panel reference standards. And in the interest of time, I don't want to go through these papers again. But yeah, a lot of times the issues that they rely on certain assumptions. Like sometimes you are required to know the performance of the imperfect reference standard exactly to apply the method, or sometimes the assumptions about the correlation structures between the different expert truthers and so on. And then for the missingness problem, the reference standard, there also have been approaches proposed, such as sensitivity analysis, or just recasting it entirely as a missing data problem and use multiple imputation. But again, there are a lot of open questions there. I don't think there's a clear consensus on how to deal with the missing reference standard. I think I skipped one slide. Oh yeah. Yeah, see here, I just wanted to give one slide showing you a concrete example of what the reference standard definition may look like in a regulatory submission. So this is a de novo submission, actually from the time before I joined the FDA. So I have nothing to do with this, but I thought it's a good example. It's the QuantX device, which is a computer-aided diagnosis software intended to assist radiologists in the assessment and characterization of breast abnormalities using MR image data. And so what they did is they take the reference standard to be the pathology report for those cancers and non-cancers that have been biopsied, and for the non-biopsied non-cancers, that take the reference standard to be from clinical and radiology reports together with a negative follow-up MRI study at minimum of 12 months. So what you see here is that they want to use the more objective reference standard whenever it's available, but then you cannot collect it for every patient. And so some kind of compromise has to be made. So then they have an approach to do as best as they can for those patients that were not biopsied. And finally, I want to discuss some of the kind of newer approaches to reference standard determination, where, in my opinion, still more research, understanding, and experience is needed, especially in the regulatory context, before we really can know for sure what to do with this. So one being electronic health records, so EHR. So the big advantage here is that you can automate the reference standard collection from AHR data using natural language processing algorithms. However, there are a lot of issues reported in the literature due to missing data or some complicated edge cases for automated processing. And also one should always keep in mind that EHR data was not collected for machine learning training or testing. It was collected for patient care and hospital processing and other purposes. So you cannot expect that it will be ideal for testing of AI systems. Another approach I want to briefly mention is that of using physical or digital phantoms or simulated or synthetic data. So the obvious big advantage here is that the reference standard is error-free because you create a simulated data or you create a physical phantom, and then obviously you know what is the ground truth. But there are a lot of open questions that remain, such as in the AI context, such as to what extent can the performance measured on a phantom be generalized to real-world clinical data? Or what if the machine learning algorithm was also trained, at least in part, on some simulated or phantom data? Can we use other simulated or phantom data, synthetic data for testing as well? Or is there an overfitting issue there where the performance will be overly optimistic? So to conclude my talk, we saw that reference standards different levels of granularity, subjectivity, variability, availability, convenience, and performance evaluation of medical AI systems should use a reference standard that is task specific and the best available as recognized by the scientific community. Moreover, uncertainty and bias in the reference standard need to be carefully considered and accounted for in study design and analysis as necessary. And an appropriate reference standard is essential to characterize the AI ML algorithm performance well and to ensure that study results appropriately reflect the actual real-world performance. I would like to thank my colleagues at the FDA who helped me with this presentation, and to them, I would like to thank the meeting organizers for inviting me to speak. I'm happy to take any questions now over email.
Great. Thank you so much, Alexei. That was a fantastic presentation. And just want to invite anyone who would like to ask a question. You can type it in the chat box, but really this is an AI expert network. So we would encourage you to just unmute your mic and ask your questions. And I know several of you are not shy, so.
Yeah, Alexei, this is Kavita. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I'm just wondering if you have a point of view on how we might prepare for training a model on something that has never been captured as images before. So it's a novel way of diagnosing, which traditionally was done in person in clinic, but something that we want to automate through image capture remotely. So what's the best way of preparing a training data set for such a situation, which is completely manual in person today, and there's no reference image set, if you will?
Sorry, I'm not sure I really understand the question. Well, can you give an example of what this looks like?
Yeah, so for example, wound healing is an example. There's never been documentation of how a wound has healed over time in the past. But if we want to build out a machine learning model that essentially reports on the progress of wound healing over a period of time remotely, rather than the patient coming in to the clinic or a nurse checking in person, that is something that is very novel, right? It's never been done before. And I know some of the companies within wound care have done this and have been able to launch certain concepts for wound healing technology. So similar to wound healing, if we want to create a monitoring tool which relies on image data sets which don't exist today, what's the best way of creating those training data sets?
Yeah, so if it's a supervised machine learning type of scenario, then you need to collect the input data and some of the output data, or something that looks like the output data that the device is supposed to output, right? And I think in your examples, probably one would need some kind of system for the subjects to report on the wound healing or whatever other application it is. Maybe there's an interesting approach is to use AI again to collect those labels or reference standard. Like if you first have another AI that a device. So you may have another AI system. That's something I've seen before. We have another AI system that, like a physical device that's used to record the state of whatever phenomenon you're trying to predict with your final device, and that can be used to collect that reference standard. I'm not sure if I'm really helping you right now, but yeah, I think it's a question of data collection. You have to have systems to collect the training data as well as the training labels if you want to use supervised learning. And then for the performance evaluation, yeah, we need to know what we're comparing to what in the end. So.
Okay, thank you. And I guess let me ask, would anyone else like to chime in who has an idea, or maybe you have an experience in that same kind of situation?
Yeah, we did a project for skin-related diagnostic for jaundice in newborns. It's supposed to be a technique to suggest whether or not whether or not the infant should be brought in or not for further evaluation. Not whether or not they actually had jaundice, but just as an indicator. It was by prescription. What it was an application, and it was also by prescription. And it was a little card that had like a little square in the middle that you'd see the skin. You put the card on the baby's tummy, and it had like little colors around it. So it would be like a calibration. And you take pictures at set distances. And I think later on we had better, it didn't matter what distance you took it at. And so it would take care of like lighting conditions and various other kinds of issues with the skin, like what any difference in coloration of the skin, depending on the racial characteristics and whatnot. It's like that was an issue. So there's a lot of different variations that mess things up a bit, that made things difficult. So you might want to think about that kind of a thing.
So then, Larry,
it's very similar.
So then, Larry, it sounds like you're describing kind of what Alexei was saying, as far as, when you don't have data, you have to collect data, and it's got to be supervised so that somebody's, helping to assess it. But
yeah,
Kavita, I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, I think he was asking about like, unsupervised, I think was what the question. I mean, it's like not always possible. I mean, to get a large data set, it's not always going to be supervised, but it can be collected in a normalized manner, I guess is the point.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
is that kind of what you're driving at?
Yes, Larry, I think more towards, when we start thinking about building out concepts and then taking it into a product development approach, what should the considerations be as we build out this data set that does not exist, as we build out these technologies that are completely manual today, and for which we're actually in the process of collecting data sets? What are the different aspects we should be thinking about? Because this most likely will be a class 2, because it's influencing clinical decision, providing a diagnosis or a prescription. So it would be nice to understand how, in the absence of available image data sets for certain AI technologies, what are some of the best practices FDA recommends in generating such data sets, and what to keep in mind?
Yeah. Is that possibility, Alexei, to have just ordinary people like collect data like that with some kind of scheme like that, like with some, trained person to collect data in some known fashion like that? Does that count?
Yeah, I mean, I could provide a little bit of input here. Stephen Odaibo here. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, I mean, it's truly novel. Starting out the concept Kavita from the very beginning, there's no really shortcut around the manual labor of domain level expertise, annotation, labeling, and data collection. And I think that best practice would be scoping the problem appropriately, and so such that it's very specific. And then there is, in general, an existing, even though probably not yet defined or written down on paper, but there's an existing mental model of a clinical reference standard. So basically the task would be to crystallize that, put that down on paper, and then do the manual labor for collecting that initial seed data set from which training begins. And normally best approach is a consensus whereby experts, can weigh in and with time, fill in the gaps or whatever deficiencies are in the initial model. But yeah, it's basically that hard manual work is almost uncircumventable.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's almost no shortcuts. And one thing I would add from the regulatory perspective, you need to understand what are you claiming with your device, what you claim the device can do. And in that, you need to have data to be able to support that claim. Like if you claim your device can diagnose X, you have to have data that's labeled as, is it X or is it not X? So you can actually prove your claim to be true, right? So that's something for the regulatory context you need to have, even if it's an unsupervised algorithm or whatever new fancy training method it is. In the end, the FDA would want to see that you have data that shows the device fulfills its claims and its intended use.
Yeah,
Great, thank you.
And just to add one more thing, if you were to break this problem down into two aspects, right? So one is collecting those images and the other is labeling the images. So I guess labeling the images, there's no shortcuts. You have to go through experts labeling them. But from a collecting images standpoint, I guess there are two ways of doing it. One is maybe the patient themselves can take some pictures, but obviously you can collect a lot of data, but you don't know how consistent it is. Or you can have an expert take a picture, but then you'll be limited by how many pictures you get, but it'll be more consistent, good data set. So certain things to consider, but overall, it's not an easy thing.
And I just wanted to add.
Yeah.
Sorry,
that's the first step. I mean, I'm talking about the first step, just consistency of collection. I mean, the labeling and what it is, that's the second step. And just, is it good enough what I'm describing? Some method can be developed that people can just take their own pictures so you can gather that data that you can then say, oh, I'm comfortable saying, okay, this is really what the picture really looks like, and I can make an evaluation on that image as an expert.
From the regulatory perspective, once you go to the test set, you need it to be representative of the target population. So if each person takes a picture, then, for example, if it's a smartphone setting, right? I don't know what setting you were thinking of, but then you would have to see, does it represent all types of patients within the intended population? Does it represent all the acquisition devices? Like if it's a smartphone picture, you maybe run into trouble because if you claim it works for every smartphone in existence, then yeah, you have to somehow support that. So of course, yeah, as you say, you need a procedure to collect it, but then you should also think about that it's representative enough.
Yeah, and I was suggesting some kind of calibration mechanism, like some reference card, colored card or something that gets placed next to, just like a photographer uses, like a 50% gray or a multicolored card or something like that, that's a reference color-based standard, that could be used, that machine learning, machine learning can then say, oh yeah, this is, I know what this is, and I can make adjustments based on this.
This seems pretty broad. Even the type of wound matters, the source of the wound. Is it a burn or is it some other source?
Yeah, so the wound healing case was an example, but I was going for skin disorders that can be remotely monitored.
Okay.
So yeah, I know wound healing, that there are AI technologies out there that that already assist with monitoring, especially for chronic diabetic patients for whom it's very important to monitor their condition. because it could quickly progress into a more complex situation. But I was going for more dermatological conditions that
Okay.
can be patient reported through
Sure.
images and can be diagnosed remotely. What could be the best practices around data collection, labeling, and performance evaluation, because all of this is in person today.
Right. I got your general question, but when it's a wound, I thought it could be a lot more types of wounds and the same thing. But once you narrow down a band, I think a process that we arrive at, we meaning if it's not there, and that could be applied to other areas, but limiting the scope to a type of skin condition or the source of why you get into that probably matters.
Now, one comment I would like to also make is that once you get into this more specific questions about a specific application, what is the best practice to collect data for that, I would suggest to look into making an FDA Q submission or pre-submission.
Okay.
So if you just look for Q submission, and that's actually an opportunity that I don't think it costs anything, as far as I know, and it's an opportunity to discuss with the FDA your plans before you actually start on the development. And the FDA actually will assemble a team, and they'll give you feedback on if your plan is appropriate.
That's great. That's great to know. Thank you, Alexei.
Okay, and Mario, I see you've got a comment. I'm assuming it's related to this discussion. So he wants to know if you guys agree that if the method does not work well enough, there are two options. You'll have to improve your algorithm or maybe collect better data. So I think it's kind of in line with the discussion of whatever you're doing, you have to have, that manual piece of it until you get your reference established and have enough data to say that it's working. So you'd have these two options. Any comments on that? Improve your algorithm or collect better data? Sound good? Okay. All right. So let's see.
I would say that I can chime in at least on that, is like from my understanding of where computer vision and I guess specifically computer vision, but the AI kind of scientific community is sort of kind of going towards is more data centric kind of development. And so that's why I think there's a lot of now focus going towards more of, what is the profile of the data? What is the quality of the data? Is data, like, Alexei said, is it representative of your target objective? And all that, as opposed to, how can we have a fixed data set and just improve the model, right? And so if one had to choose one or the other, I would, without a doubt, go with collecting better data, because I do firmly believe that it is the data that largely drives performance. And along that line, maybe I can pose a question: is how is the FDA sort of thinking about ways of not just now regulating model changes, but perhaps data changes over time? Because I believe the most recent efforts by the FDA have been kind of around, how do we adjust regulatory frameworks to kind of account for kind of maybe real-time, model updates or changes. But as the field is now moving back towards, data centricity, how do we then also account perhaps for data changes? Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, this is a relatively new area. So far, from what I observe, is that most devices are approved or cleared for kind of very specific data collection or specific kind of data acquisition equipment and so on. Like if you have a medical imaging AI, it's intended to work with a specific imaging scanner with specific parameters and so on, right? So it kind of tries to avoid the data changes in that way. And then if you would want to use it with a new version of the scanner or with a different manufacturer's scanner, maybe you would have to come back to the FDA with a supplement to the submission. So I think that's how it sort of works right now. And of course, people want to extend on that. And then, of course, there are other issues. I think maybe what you're talking about is sort of the distribution shift over time in the data in general. Maybe if you look at something like EHR data and the clinical practice changes over time, and so the data will change over time. in unpredictable ways. There, I think there are a lot of open questions.
And the different modalities, right? You know, if we're trying to build up AI as a value proposition where it can generalize to so many more new cases, how in the world do we account for some of that even leading up to maybe getting it on the market? You know?
So I think some of that, if you've seen, the FDA has a white paper on a proposed framework, regulatory framework for adaptive algorithms, and there's some follow-ups to that as well. So some of that is kind of covered under this, where the manufacturer essentially is expected to pre-specify what kind of changes they're considering and what kind of data changes would be also covered under the pre-specified change plan. And then they would do like regular performance evaluations on their own without coming back to the FDA. So that's kind of one of the proposed approaches, but it's being worked on. It's not regulatory policy now. It was a discussion paper, and it has follow-ups, and it's still all in discussion right now between FDA and stakeholders. So unfortunately, I cannot give you an answer here what FDA is going to do. This will be very case by case at this point.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
Thank
Alexei,
you.
I just want to second what you said. So we're currently in substantive review for an AI retina screening device for diabetic retinopathy. And indeed, the FDA is highly, superbly specific about the hardware that's being used in conjunction with an SAMD. Not only do you have to show your safety and efficacy in clinical study on the different devices that you propose, but you also have to typically have a precision study, reproducibility and repeatability with particular devices. So back to Kavita's question as well, in collecting that data, one has to really begin, and Alexei, you mentioned this, of course, with the intended uses of that device, and that's highly specific, and then everything else stems from there.
Yeah, you can of course go the other way as well. If you already have data, and then you see what intended use would be compatible with the data I have, what kind of intended use can I support with my data, you can also do this way, of course.
And that's the manufacturer's prerogative in terms of what they propose as their intended use. And a Q submission is indeed a very great avenue for that, to hash that out.
Yeah, I highly recommend the Q submission pathway. It's an interactive process. We can discuss with the FDA.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So we're getting close to the top of the hour, to the point where I don't think we should really dive into a whole nother discussion. I did put a link in the chat box where we have a Slack community, and you guys can stay engaged with each other all year, every day, every minute if you want. You can continue the discussion, chime in on what each other is asking, or share thoughts. So it's free for anyone to join. You can share it with others and just continue the discussion. But at this point, I think it's probably best to end today's meeting. And I want to thank Alexei for joining us and for fostering such great discussion and thought leadership. Thank you for all that you're doing in FDA and for your passion to collaborate with industry so we can all move forward together. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay. And we'll have the slides and recordings available on the Xavier website most likely by Monday. So feel free to access that, and that's for anyone to access, so you can share that as well. But
Thanks,
in the
Marla.
meantime, I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. Thank you. All right, take care.
You too, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.
Thanks, everyone.
you.
Bye-bye.